Welcome. My name is Brunilda Marilisluga de Favorites, and I am the Master Instructor for Russian at Howard University's Department of World Languages and Cultures here in Washington, D.C. Thank you all for joining us today for what is going to be a timely and important conversation about the case of Brittney Griner, who was detained in Moscow nearly 1 year ago today, just 1 week prior to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So a note of housekeeping: if you have questions for our speakers, please use the question and answer feature in Zoom, rather than raising your hand. We will be monitoring the question and answer feature throughout the event, and we'll move to your questions following the presentation. And now I have the great honor of presenting our speakers before giving them both an opportunity to deliver some opening remarks. First, I am proud to present to you Kimberly St. Julian-Varnon, a doctoral student in history at the University of Pennsylvania. Her work examines the intersections of Black experience and Soviet understandings of race and nationality. She followed Brittney Griner's case closely, giving multiple media appearances, consulting with the WNBA Players Union about the case. Probably you caught her in one of her many MSNBC or CNN appearances during the year. I am very proud to present Dr. William Pomeranz. Dr. Pomeranz is the director of the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute and an expert guide to the Russian legal system. He leverages extensive hands-on experience on international and Russian jurisprudence to address a wide range of legal issues, from the development of Russia's constitution to human rights law to foreign investment and sanctions. He is also the author of Law and the Russian State: Russia's Legal Evolution from Peter the Great to Vladimir Putin. So we want to start by giving both of our speakers an opportunity to deliver some opening remarks. So Ms. St. Julian-Varnon, if you could go first.
Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you to the Kennan Institute for hosting this very timely event. So I will discuss and I'll focus on kind of the domestic politics side of Brittney Griner's case, as well as some of the implications of the wider context of when she was detained a week before Russia launched its latest invasion of Ukraine, and how I believe that her case was intimately tied to Russia's latest war in Ukraine. So I think that Brittney Griner's case really crystallized a lot of key, highly conflictual issues in the United States, particularly in our social relationships, issues of race, and issues of gender and pay equity, issues of LGBTQ community issues, but also marijuana possession. So her detainment represented pretty much almost every pressure point in contemporary United States politics, all in one case. And so in a lot of the work that I did, and the interviews I did, a constant discussion was, did her detainment have to do with her race? And so what I tried to do is, using my historical research, and deep knowledge of my personal experience in the region, but also trying to help people understand that her race mattered considerably to Russia because it mattered to the United States. It was an issue, it was a pressure point that Russia could use to, cause some domestic conflict about her detainment. And also you have the issues of her celebrity. She is pretty much the most well-known American, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, to be detained in Russia. So you have questions of, what does that mean? Does that mean her case gets special treatment? And we saw some of this conflict during the discussions about her release, between the treatment of Paul Whelan, for example, and the treatment of her case. And one of the key issues I think that we learned was, one, Russia will use what it can use to create domestic issues for the United States because it makes Russia look stronger. But also, and I've argued this from day one, that issues of racial inequality and gender inequality, they become national security issues. And I think we saw that front and center with Brittney's case. But one of the key questions I also received was, why was she even in Russia? Get that question all the time. Why was Brittney Griner in Russia? She's one of the highest paid WNBA players in the entire league, but compared to colleagues in the NBA, she's significantly underpaid. And that's one of the reasons why she and dozens of other WNBA players played in Russia. She had played in Russia for 7 years. She was a known entity in Russia, including, in fact, her Yekaterinburg coach and some of her teammates actually testified on her behalf during her trial in Russia. So she was also there kind of to earn money, but also being a cultural ambassador for the United States. The WNBA players, they are cultural ambassadors. They play in Turkey, they play in Russia, they played all around the world, and they kind of are cultural exports of something that's really important to American culture, which is basketball, but also provides them income because there is a huge pay disparity between men and women's athletes in the United States. So I think that's important to remember. And people are like, oh, why was she there? She was there to earn money and to, take care of herself, but also to continue to be a cultural ambassador for basketball that she had been doing for almost a decade. And I think another key issue of her detainment, and one that worried me, I think more than her race, was her status as an out and married lesbian woman. As we've seen over the past 15 years, Russia has cracked down considerably on the LGBTQ community in Russia. You have issues of various draconian laws about promoting, these immoral lifestyles, as they call it, which target LGBTQ people. So her being out as a lesbian and very proud of her identity was actually a very big concern to me, because she could be targeted in the prison system, but also we weren't sure how her status and how her LGBTQ community belonging could impact how she was seen in Russia and shape the outcome of her case. And so in many ways, we kind of saw Americans getting in touch with and understanding the more international harms that we saw against the LGBT community. We have these issues in the United States, and in many ways, they're even worse in Russia. And so she kind of was bridging our understanding of the ways in which these communities are being, oppressed across these two countries. Another issue that came up, and it makes sense that it came up, was the issue of marijuana possession. And there were a lot of discussions in the United States about, well, we have people in the United States who are arrested and who are serving time for having marijuana possession. So one, why should we trade, an arms dealer for Brittney Griner when we have thousands of people locked up in the United States? Or on the flip side, if we release Brittney Griner, if we work to get her out, then we should free everyone in prison. And so these were interesting arguments to me because, one, I didn't understand why one had to happen and not the other. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive things, but Joe Biden and the Biden administration has no control over marijuana policy in Russia. And so once again, we see how the confluence of these domestic political issues in the United States are crystallized in Brittney Griner's case and often lead to these discussions, which don't necessarily draw away from her ordeal, but we're missing the key connection in that Brittney was being held in Russia under the Putin regime. And that was the kind of the context in which we needed to understand what was happening to her. So in terms of U.S. Russia relations, and a lot of what I did with the WNBA Players Union was to explain the intricacies of what it meant to be a Black woman in Russia, to be a Black gay woman in Russia, but also to help them understand the penal system in Russia and, the ways in which it's different from the United States, especially because this is early on, the first few weeks of public knowledge of her detainment. There were a lot of moving pieces. And initially our approach was to be silent just because we were at the nadir, the absolute lowest point of U.S. Russia relations at that point. We had very little diplomatic representation in Russia. So it was kind of allowing us to figure out, okay, what's happening on the ground? What contacts do we have? The United States government who are working with the State Department, but also the Biden administration's having to deal with the latest invasion. So you have this massive international conflagration going on between Russia and Ukraine. And at the same time, you have very little American diplomatic representation, and you have a United States basketball player who was held in Russian detention. So I know there was a lot of pushback against the initial stages in terms of taking a back seat, being quiet, allowing the machinery to work. But I will stand by that because I think it was the best option at the time when you don't have a lot of information and you aren't really sure how the war is going to work out or how the United States, NATO, the EU are going to respond to Russian aggression. And so that's why I've always argued that her detainment is intimately tied with the war in Ukraine. Even when we have her release, it's during the winter, during the kind of low period of the fighting, we're gearing up and we see the spring offensive that's supposed to be happening in February and March. So I think the timing is also important. And another point, I think, when we think about U.S.-United States relations and the ways in which these types of prisoner exchanges work, but also the media coverage of these prisoner exchanges. What I saw, what I was very surprised by, was the influx of internet chatter and disinformation that was going on when it became public that the United States was considering a prisoner exchange for Viktor Bout. You started having people talking about earlier cases in which white American women had been detained or arrested in Russia behind marijuana possession for greater amounts than Brittney Griner, and then they were released or they were given, a fine. And so something I tried to do is to talk about the difference in context. An arrest in Russia behind marijuana possession in 2016, when Russian-U.S. relations were much better, is very different than January 2022, when Russia's been planning this war. And so what I try to do is try to cut through a lot of the noise to provide that historical context, that political context, because at the outset, we have this very real conversation of, oh, well, they charged Brittney Griner with more. They gave her this ridiculous sentence because she's Black and she had very little marijuana. She had, THC oil with her versus, a white woman who was pretty much given a slap on the wrist years earlier. And immediately, if you're thinking in an American legal context, you have a very different understanding of what that can mean with Russia during this political context, particularly when it comes to a war. So what I try to do is explain these differences and try to help people understand that we can't use the United States in our understandings of the United States and our legal system as a global lens to understand the workings of other countries, particularly with Russia, because it's not going to work. It's not very helpful. Finally, a thing that I noticed, and I wrote about this, I discussed this. In many ways, Brittney Griner she awoke in the United States in our public discourse about the plight of detained Americans across the world in foreign countries, and really how little recourse there is for so many people, the over 40 Americans who are declared wrongfully detained. And something that I think was important was it was necessary for us to realize the United States doesn't have a magic wand. Joe Biden couldn't send SEAL Team 6 in to break Brittney Griner out of Russian prison. Even if she was, Tom Brady, if she was LeBron James, they all would have still been in a Russian prison. The whole point of this is for Russia to show that it is still a world power, that it is still a power that Western powers have to think about and consider and deal with. And so you can't just use Western will to get Russia to do what it wants. I think that's part of what we saw with the elongation of these negotiations, when some months Russia was interested in negotiating, some months Russia wasn't interested in negotiating. And even then, at the final result, when we were hoping for a 2-for-1 deal for Paul Whelan and Brittney Griner, and we got Brittney, right? I think that's another element of these power dynamics in which Russia decided either you get Brittney Griner or you get nothing. And so I think that's another important element of this that we have to remember, is that we're dealing with a hostile foreign power who's engaging in an incredibly brutal war against an ally that we're supporting. And all of this is coming together into the case in the person of Brittney Griner in a jail cell in Russia. And so hopefully what we have a better understanding of now, and I mean we as an American public, are the importance of international politics, for sure, but also the importance of understanding and being able to use a more global lens to understand some developments. Because if we get too focused on the American context, we lose the forest for the trees. And luckily, Brittney Griner is home. And I know that she is now a face for detained Americans across the world. And now people are more aware and they're fighting. People are still fighting for Paul Whelan to be released and to come home. And something I was speaking with a few people who are representing detained families, the momentum has never been greater. So in many ways, her case will hopefully help dozens of families get their loved ones back home, but also make sure that the State Department knows that we now have our focus on detained Americans and bringing them home. So I'm hoping that her case and her ordeal represent a watershed for detained Americans across the United States and across the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. St. Julian-Varnon. I want to remind everybody that if you have any questions, do put them in the question and answer feature in Zoom. rather than raising your hand, and we will keep track of the questions as we go along. And now, Dr. Pomeranz, if you could go ahead and provide us some more contextual knowledge about the situation.
Thanks very much, and thanks, Kimberly, for putting all these issues on the table in a very concise way. I'm going to talk about the question of U.S. Russian relations, but I'm also going to talk about the broader retreat from global human rights standards and institutions that has taken place in Russia in the aftermath of this war. The first thing that we need to mention is that this became a political case for all the reasons that Kimberly outlined. And there have been historically numerous political cases in Russian courts. It goes to the Tsarist time, Soviet time, and indeed to the present day. So Russia is not immune from politicization of its court process. What happened was, in this particular case, the politicization of the case was quickly drawn into the question of the war and the implementations of sanctions, our strong support for Ukraine, support for Ukrainian territorial integrity, and so forth. So it became political almost immediately, as Kimberly mentioned, because of the international relations situation. There is a question, however, about President Biden's negotiations tactics in this case, because he immediately raised the stakes of the detention of Brittney Griner. He said that we were going to get her home. He said that she was wrongfully detained. And so, in light of all the charges that President Biden immediately put on the table, in fact, we had limited our leverage, I think, in negotiating for Brittney's release, because the Russians knew that this was a political issue in the United States, and the United States had placed a tremendous amount of political capital on making sure that Brittney Griner got home. So I think, in light of the questions that Kimberly raised about how we deal with detained people in the future, I think that this case really kind of shows that we don't want necessarily to negotiate this in public. That when the public gets involved, when it becomes a hot issue in social media, it means that we have kind of lost the direct person-to-person, nation-to-nation contact that allows these prisoners to get exchanged. So I think that one of the important things that the Brittney Griner case emphasized is, do we politicize them, and do we negotiate in public? Or alternatively, do we try to do this behind closed doors in the hope that these negotiations will be successful, with the caveat that if it's done behind closed doors, then really no one is advocating for the people who are detained, and they become forgotten, essentially. So that strategy also has its weaknesses. But we found out in the Brittney Griner case that to put everything on the table and to make it a major political question for the United States, in fact, decreased our leverage. And therefore, when we decided that we wanted to do a 2-for-1 swap, President Putin said, no, it's just going to be 1-for-1. And as Kimberly said, if you want 2-for-1, there's no deal. And therefore, Biden had to accept the deal. So I think there is an important lesson here as to how we negotiate in these detention cases. And we don't want to encourage Russia simply to gain more detained persons so that they can negotiate more in the future. So I think that's one of the important things that we've learned in the Brittney Griner case. Now, as Kimberly indicated, she really didn't have a chance in Russian court. The Russian court system, the criminal court system, is notoriously famous for not having any acquittals. So it's a 99% conviction rate. That's great for the prosecutors and their career prospects, but it's not great for defendants. So Brittney really never had a chance in terms of defending herself in Russia. And she essentially did what she could only do, was basically plead guilty. And then after she had been found guilty, then tried to negotiate a release. And that's what happened. But it shows really the inadequacies of the Russian criminal justice system when there is really no possibility to gain a acquittal. Now, I think I want to now delve into the broader trends in Russian law and human rights law that have also accompanied not only the Griner case, but its ability and its willingness to abide by international legal norms. So Russia, in the immediate aftermath of this war, decided to quit the European Court of Human Rights, and it began to close down a whole series of human rights groups and journalists and other organizations that were important, indeed critical, in defending human rights in Russia. So that it closed down Memorial, it has liquidated the Moscow-Helsinki group, the Sakharov Center was declared undesirable, it was evicted from its premises. The cases of the diminishment of the human rights community and the inability now of Russians to advocate for human rights, both on a domestic and an international level, has really hampered the pursuit of human rights, which, for better or for worse, had some noticeable achievements, as it were, in the aftermath of the end of the Soviet Union, in terms of gaining access to international jurisdictions and so forth. So I think that in the aftermath of this case, what we've discovered is that Russia is still chasing after domestic enemies in even more egregious ways. And there are a list of people who are in prison, who are notable political figures, including Alexei Navalny, journalists, human rights activists, and so forth, who have been detained and basically have no chance of getting an acquittal in the Russian judicial system. What's interesting, though, was that not only has Putin and the Russian Federation gone after prominent people, but we now see a lot more everyday people and going to jail and being arrested, as an example. So there was an Arctic professor who was arrested, a physicist, an engineer, and so forth. So that what was thought to be a selective punishment procedure that would scare people because they had gone after the most prominent individuals has now changed. And Russia now is going after less prominent people, and that will have important consequences for the judicial system going forward. As Kimberly mentioned, not only have they gone after everyday people, major people, but they've created new enemies, new enemies who speak out against the war, who try to discredit the Russian military, and obviously the gay community. And that has been the most noticeable new law in the past 3 months, that they have gone after propaganda of the gay community amongst adults, even while not really explaining what the standard is that you could prosecute people for. So I think that the judicial system in Russia, all of its flaws and problems were on display during the Griner case. They have only gotten worse after the Griner case. And I think that Russia's decision to abandon international human rights standards will make any sort of settlement of this war much more difficult whenever and however this war ends. But I'll close on a slightly positive note, and that is this war has raised issues about international standards of justice and transitional justice. So Russia basically has so many cards to play that it can exempt itself from international jurisdiction. It can, it's not a member of the International Criminal Court. It's not a member of the Rome statutes, so it can't be tried internationally for crimes against aggression or crimes against peace. And that it has become apparent that the standards of international justice that were started in Nuremberg after World War II and were attempted in the immediate aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union in Yugoslavia, Rwanda, and so forth, are not adequate and simply will not be able to bring Russia to justice and will not be able to be held accountable. So I think that one of the major transitions and of this war is that there will be an impetus to somehow change the international criminal justice system so that Russia and its human rights violations, its violations of territorial integrity and so forth, can be held accountable. And with that, I'll close.
Great, thank you. And just reminding you, you can post your questions in our question and answer feature, and we will be monitoring them throughout the panel. I'm gonna take my moderator's privilege to do the first follow-up, and I have one for each of you. So, Ms. St. Julian-Varnon, as a historian, right, I was wondering, how do you see this particular case fitting within the larger continuum of the African-American experience with Russia? For those who are not very familiar, 1930s, a lot of African-American intellectuals traveled as part of this cultural diplomacy initiative to Russia, which was then the former Soviet Union, in the famous case of disinformation during the Trump elections, and to this day. So I was wondering, where do you see this case sort of fitting in that continuum of the African-American experience with Russia? And then after that, Dr. Pomeranz, I would like you to sort of talk a little bit about the implication of the fact that this is a legal system where if you go, you're going to be declared guilty, which sort of sets a very different set of expectations as when there are cases in the United States. So, Ms. St. Julian-Varnon, I'll let you go first.
So I think that's a good question, and I'm thinking through what that means, because for a long time, particularly during the Soviet period, African Americans were privileged foreign visitors and foreign residents of the Soviet Union. Not only because African Americans were seen as representatives of one of the most oppressed proletariat classes, but also because they were, and I argue this, and a couple of other people argue this, it's because they were also representatives of the United States, which was the modern, industrial competitor to the Soviet Union. And so what I think Brittney's case represents is kind of a turning point, really, for African American engagement with Russia. So that privileged position clearly no longer exists. And so then you had, the earlier discussions, I think, oh my God, the tall basketball player who went to North Korea, Dennis Rodman, was like, he's going to go to Russia and negotiate for Brittney Griner. So you kind of see that there is a big change. I mean, the post 1991 Russia versus how African Americans and Africans are treated in the Soviet Union, but that privileged position, I think, is gone. And I think particularly for African American, basketball players, anyone in sports, they're gonna second guess and probably not go to Russia or most places in Eastern Europe, honestly, because of the way Brittney was treated, and not just the way people talked about her in the United States, but the way she was talked about in Russian television, the way she was talked about in Russian social media, really from the George Floyd protests in 2020 through Brittney's detainment. There has been an influx of really anti-Black rhetoric against African Americans that you just really didn't see during the Soviet period. So that's kind of part of what my research is doing, is to provide the long arc of that narrative.
I'll just talk about the Russian criminal justice system and talk about the incentives of the major actors And I think the incentives is very instructive, not only for the Russian judicial system, but for other judicial systems as well. Because all the incentives for Russian criminal prosecutors, judges, etc., is biased towards conviction. So for a prosecutor, if he or she wants to make a career in the procracy, he or she cannot have a lot of cases that are decided with acquittals. That is a black mark on their legal record. For judges, if their incentive is that it is a black mark on their career if cases are overturned, if too many cases are overturned. So the incentive structure in the Russian judicial system is all geared towards acquittal. And it has been so since the Soviet period. And trying to break that, that trend has basically been impossible. And there were various attempts to bring in new criminal justice procedures, to bring in more practicing lawyers as judges, but this has not been the case. And so the incentive structure in the Russian criminal judicial system has basically for 70 plus years always been biased against the defendant. And we won't have any sort of legal reform, real legal reform, until these incentives are changed as well.
Great. We have a couple of questions coming in. I want to again remind our audience, feel free to post questions in the question and answer box. So I have one from Haley Gibson, and this one is mostly directed at Ms. St. Julian-Varnon, but Dr. Pomeranz, if you have any opinion, feel free to chime in too. So to Ms. St. Julian-Varnon, do you think the Griner case will help people realize the issues not just in Russia's penal system, but in America's as well? In other words, do you think people will have noticed the double standard of the U.S. government viewing Brittney's detainments for marijuana as wrongful, while still continuing to view it as a problematic legal issue in the United States?
Definitely, and I think that came up quite a bit when we're thinking about, and you see the early public conversations about exchanging Viktor Bout for Brittney. But I think what was lost in that was Brittney wasn't declared wrongfully detained because she was, arrested for having THC vape cartridges. It was because she was charged with the equivalent of drug trafficking. It was the extremity of the charge that she was facing. And I think that's one of the reasons why you saw the United States getting involved versus in other cases with Americans who are in similar legal situations in Russia behind marijuana possession. But I think it has definitely shown, and people have made a lot of, people have talked a lot about the double standard. But will that lead to political change? That's another conversation. But I definitely think that I saw those conversations happening in her case at a national and local political level. So I think the conversation is definitely on the table.
Kimberly has answered that question.
Great. So I'm going to direct the next question to Dr. Pomeranz, knowing how the Cannons Institute role in promoting better relations with Russia. And the question is, what has Brittney Griner's detention taught us about the use of megaphone diplomacy?
I think the detention and the case of Brittney Griner has given added impetus for megaphone diplomacy, with the caveat, as I said, that these types of cases really require very tense negotiations. And if they are negotiated in public, then our ability, or the US ability for flexibility, is limited. So I think what we learned in the Brittney Griner case is, even though everyone wanted to get Brittney home, by openly declaring that this was our objective and that this was going to happen as soon as possible, we limited our options in terms of negotiations. And we ultimately ended up with a person who was detained on a minuscule amount of marijuana for a arms dealer who was serving 25 years in the United States. So if indeed we are going to try to negotiate other exchanges, it really needs to be done behind closed doors, but we also need to make sure that there's some advocacy so that these people don't get lost and forgotten. And that's a very difficult balance to make, but that is the one that we really have to try to do. Because as Kimberly said, you know, Brittney was charged in Russia, and there was only so many things that we could do in terms of influencing the Russian judicial system, i.e. none. So that's, I think, megaphone diplomacy can help, but it can also hinder as well.
Great. So we have a question from William Myers, and I'll let both of you decide who wants to answer it. And the question is, I believe Russia was also recently expelled from the Council of Europe. Does that reduce external pressures on Russian behavior? I think this is all sort of getting at the point you pointed out, Dr. Pomeranz, about Russia's increasing isolation as it gets separated from all of these international organizations.
I'll take a stab at that first. I think that one of the major changes in Russia at the end of the Cold War was its entry into the European Court of Human Rights and its willingness to abide by the European Convention of Human Rights. That was a landmark decision that had internal consequences both on human rights and the Russian judicial system, because Russians, when they became a member of the European Court of Human Rights, had another set of jurisdiction that they could go to and advocate for legal remedies. And Russians appealed to the European Court of Human Rights by the thousands. And really a case law was established. Russia's not a common law country, but a type of case law was established in Russia for these human rights violations. And so it was very important that Russia became a member. Now, there was a great controversy when Russia was admitted to the European Court, because many felt that it did not have the judicial procedures in order to allow it to become a real member of the judicial system. And there was a lot of debate whether it was too early for Russia in the 1990s to join these European institutions. And I think the decision was ultimately made that it was better to have Russia on the bottom looking up rather than on the outside looking in. And in many ways, that was the right decision, because Russia and Russians availed themselves to the European Court and other foreign jurisdictions in great numbers. Unfortunately, as I said, one of the first things that President Putin did in the aftermath of this war was it announced that Russia was not going to be a part of the European Court or any European institutions. And indeed, Europe has been probably the most vociferous in talking about Russian human rights violations and openly declaring Russia as a terrorist state, which the Parliamentary Assembly has done. So I think that the decision to separate from Europe will have implications for decades on the Russian judicial system. And I don't think that the Europeans will give Russia the benefit of the doubt anytime this war ends and allow them to simply return back to these institutions.
Okay, great, super. So here's an interesting question. I'm not sure if Either of you has the answer, but it's really kind of interesting. From Michael Abbott, are there historical equivalents of U.S. Russia quote unquote criminal swaps? Historically, I understand these swaps have been between spies.
Kimberly, do you want to? I know about some spies, but I think that was, and there was a bridge in Berlin that they all crossed in order to be exchanged. But
yes, they tended to be between spies, although there are some cases of the United States being involved, or East Germany, West Germany being involved, of swaps of Soviet dissidents for Soviet spies who are in American or West German custody. So a big case, I think, was in the late 70s. So like Alexander Ginsburg, it was a big dissident. He was exchanged for a couple of Soviet spies. But I think that is kind of what makes Brittney's case so interesting, is that, you know, it's a civilian. It's not these old school Cold War spy swaps. It's a civilian. And I think so before that, we had Trevor Reed, who was exchanged for, you know, a kind of highly dangerous Russian convict. So I think this is kind of part and parcel of the post-Soviet change, is that it's no longer necessarily for spies, but if Russia's going to continue to try to get its high-level criminals out of American prisons, it's going to have Americans who are charged with severe crimes in Russia. So I think this is kind of a new stage of that type of hostage diplomacy that we saw in the Cold War.
Just to add, I think one of the problems for Paul Whelan is that he's been charged with espionage. And so basically the Russians said we couldn't kind of put him in the same category as Brittney, and therefore they didn't want to swap there are many reasons why they didn't want a 2-for-1 swap, but that was one of them as well. So for Paul Whelan, his problem is that he is considered a person who was engaged in espionage, although that wasn't the case. And trying to exchange him will be that much more difficult.
Great. From Kate Copy, director at Dr. Pomeranz, how does the bias toward conviction in the judicial system impact decisions by Russian citizens to engage in protest or challenge the government?
Obviously, there's been a huge amount of legislation to limit the ability of Russians to protest. And I would have to go back and look over the legislation, but basically, you can have a protest in Russia if I think 5 people congregate together. So the ability to protest against the Russian government, whether it be this war, whether it be in human rights cases, whether it be kind of social rights. One of the things that Putin has emphasized during his reign is that he is not concerned with the overall level of human rights and civil liberties, but he is very much concerned about social rights. And he always advocates that Russia needs to deal with these social rights more in terms of its overall political and governmental policy. So the attempt to emphasize social rights over political rights has been one of the ways by which Putin has diminished the demand and the ability to protest human rights. And he has tried to box it in this question of social rights. And that has been fairly successful. Although, again, there have been significant protests against Putin, most notably when he came back to office in 2012 in the Bolotnaya protests. And what they did there was they arrested a number of the protesters, gave them severe prison sentences, and basically said to the Russian people, if you are willing to go out and protest, there will be consequences for your freedom.
Thank you, Dr. Pomeranz. So Kate Copy posted a follow-up question for Ms. St. Julian-Varnon. um, which is, what relationship or relationships do you see between anti-Blackness in Russia and other forms of prejudice against non-Slavs? And in this case, I'd also add other ethnic groups in Russia.
It's a great question, and I think that there was a conversation that the BBC Russia service had with Afro-Russians in 2020, and they asked one of the Afro-Russians who she thought, if there would be a Black Lives Matter protest in Russia or Black Lives Matter movement. And she said she doubted it because of how repressive the government was. But if there was, it should start with Central Asians because of the incredible amount of oppression that Central Asians face, open violence against Central Asians. And you also have in major cities like Moscow, you have them ghettoized, including people from the Caucasus. So I think that this type of anti-Blackness, it's subsumed with this super nationalist view of Russia. And it's not just within Russia. Outside of Russia, a lot of these alt-right and very highly, white supremacist groups, they look at Russia as a beacon of whiteness. It's an idea that Russia is this highly Christian, anti-LGBTQ, uniform white country, which we know Russia isn't. But a lot of Putin's marriage between these very conservative ideas, but also super nationalist ideas, have allowed Russia to kind of have this idea and this interpretation by a lot of far-right groups outside of Russia, including the United States, Hungary, Serbia. I mean, we've seen this globally. So Russia's kind of part of this kind of global idea of white supremacy. But what it does mean is that you have incredibly difficult living situations for people who are not Slavic presenting, and even for Slavs. I mean, Ukrainians are being abused and misused in Russia, but even by Russians outside of Russia. So what worries me, and it's been a concern for me, since 2014, really, is if Putin and if Russians see Ukrainians the way that they do, how can they in any way, shape, or form really view the humanity of people who aren't even Slavic? And I think we've seen that. So my concern is it's going to get much worse before it gets better. So I think we have to keep our eyes open, but also when we think about how Russia's trying to engage with Africa, it hides this form of anti-Blackness. So that's another question and I'm working on as well as this kind of Janus-like two-faced behavior between Russia and Africa and the Soviet Union and Africa when it comes to hiding anti-Blackness, but depending on Africa to launder its reputation.
That's a very good point, and I believe Foreign Minister Lavrov has now been touring various different African nations and trying to basically show that Russia is indeed an international player, but they really haven't changed, I think, global opinion about Russia and its role, both domestically and in foreign affairs, and its unwillingness to basically grant human rights to various minorities in the Russian Federation.
Great. So we have a question from Zachary Forsyth. What do you think the significance is of the United States declaring yesterday that all U.S. citizens should evacuate Russia? Why now, and what does this indicate for people that are currently detained and may be detained in the future? So this is an either of you can take question.
Well, I'm not familiar with those Americans who have decided to stay through this whole ordeal, but clearly I think that's a not so veiled explanation that the United States will be unable to deal with any sort of detainees in the aftermath of this war, however it now unfolds.
Absolutely, and I think that I mean, I'm doing my PhD. I do Russian Soviet history. I think there's going to have to come a time in the field where we have discussions about the ethics and like the possibilities of doing research in Russia. So if you are doing research in Russia right now, you need to get out. The United States government is telling you that we have no tools to get you out. And I think an important part of what Dr. Pomeranz said about megaphone diplomacy, one of the issues is we used our megaphone and now the political capital is spent. So if you are an American who is detained in Russia from now on, it's going to be very difficult or close to impossible to get you out, particularly as long as this war is going on. So for your safety, you need to leave Russia as soon as you can.
No, and this is obviously a recurring problem at the Kennan Institute, because obviously we want to engage with Russians. We have done so in the past, but we're simply not able to go there, and Russians aren't able to come here. And it's very difficult to engage in a scholarly dialogue when you can't even have any sort of face-to-face discussions.
So this is a follow-up question. First up, Ms. St. Julian-Varnon, and then Dr. Pomeranz, if you want to add in there. And this also talks about some of the challenges that we face in the field. I teach at the only historically Black university with a Russian program. It's a Russian minor. The Russian Language Journal this winter put out an article where they crunched the numbers, and they saw that only 4 males that self-identified as Black majored in Russian in the United States between 2010 and 2014. So diversity in the field is definitely a challenge, but particularly when you look at the need to better understand Russian global involvement, it's an asset. So, Ms. St. Julian-Varnon, definitely you're working on your PhD. You're about as personally invested as anybody can be in this field. And yeah, some of my students are watching. So yeah, what do we do now? I'm including myself in that group, being involved in the area. And sort of Dr. Pomeranz, if you want to sort of look also at the implications for places like the Canon, which are the main explainers of Russia for the United States, what happens in this kind of situation. So
well, I think one of the key things the field can take away from what's happening is, one, we need to diversify our work on the region. We can't just depend on Russia to build scholarly knowledge, but also looking at different avenues of understanding Soviet and Imperial Russian history, and incorporating better the other titular nationalities, or the big nationalities in the Soviet Union, in the post-Soviet space. But I also think that one of the clearest things, and the field is starting to kind of grapple with this, I mean, there are significant challenges when you are a person of color who works in the region. Like, I can't just go and promise, and count on a homestay in Moscow and be safe, right? That is not a possibility for me. But I do think there are a lot of ways around it. And because of the war, I've had to shift my dissertation. My dissertation is mostly going to be Russia and Ukraine. And now that's not possible. So I'm shifting to study more popular culture. So I have access to newspapers, magazines, but also I'm adding East Germany as a comparative case. So I can go to the archives in Berlin. So I think it means we have to be very, we have to be creative in our research questions. We have to be open to changing our research, but also this is a chance for us to work with scholars from the region who have the expertise in the archives that we don't have, and really bring them in and work with them and try to make those relationships better and improve those relationships. So I hope that we can learn as a field to expand our horizons beyond Russia, but also to recognize the benefits of working with scholars from the region and talking with them instead of over them.
I would just echo that last thought, that what has been lost is our ability to talk about the region with regional scholars, and not only just Russian regional scholars, but the regional scholars who deal with all the different ethnicities of Russia. And I do think that we are in for a seismic shift in how we study Russia, whether the focus on Russia and Russians, I think, is about to change. I think that the emphasis on places like Central Asia and the Caucasus will grow. So I think that the kind of Cold War paradigm of just looking at Russia and thinking that it was actually a nation state is not going to be the same paradigm going forward. And I definitely think that the notion of post-Soviet will be retired after this controversy, because I don't think Ukraine wants to be considered post-Soviet, and I know a lot of other of the former states of the Soviet Union do not like that category as well. So I think we are entering a new period, which will, I think, engage a lot of people. But we will, as Kimberly said, we will need to change with the times and the facts on the ground as well.
Great. And we have one more question from Elise Wirtschafter. I was interested to hear Dr. Pomeranz's comments about the lack of change in the Russian and also historically in the Soviet judicial system. My question concerns how he envisions a more robust international court system. I cannot help but to imagine another United Nations to deal with these kinds of issues.
So the question is, who can deal with the human rights violations and atrocities in Ukraine? That's the question that I was kind of trying to address in what I talked about previously. And what we've discovered is that the infrastructure just won't allow us to bring and hold Russia accountable. So there is going to have to be a shift in terms of how a superpower or regional power simply is able to get around the international law by simply saying they're not going to abide by it. This is the new reality. And I think that there have been various sorts of new mechanisms that have been proposed. For example, I think the EU has proposed maybe creating a tribunal attached to the EU as opposed to a UN organization that will deal with the atrocities in Ukraine. I think that there is a question as to what law would be actually involved in such a trial, in such a proceeding, because unlike the international order, Ukraine has a law on the books dealing with crimes against peace. So there is every possibility that maybe a tribunal based in Europe under Ukrainian law, and the Ukrainians have documented all of these human rights violations that have taken place on its territory. Maybe that is the way going forward, with the caveat that, I don't think Vladimir Putin's going to show up in The Hague and say, yes, I'm willing to subject myself to jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. That won't be, it won't be a Nuremberg moment where you see the people in the dock. But I think that what is going to happen is that at some point, Russia will be held accountable without necessarily having people facing criminal trial, and that this will be the impetus for a new way to hold Russia accountable, because the current system of international law and international criminal justice can't do it.
Great. So we're coming close to our closing time. And just for the closing question, what do you both see as possibly the most unexpected takeaway from this whole case? Because to be honest, if you sit down and you look at it, you would think it's out of some sort of like Hollywood mentality that this case emerged. Just the whole setup of, Yekaterinburg, which most Americans have not even heard of. There's high-level diplomatic discussions. So what was your most sort of surprising or unexpected takeaway from this whole situation?
That's a very good question. I turn it over to Kimberly, but maybe Kimberly doesn't have an immediate answer either.
It's like, I have an idea. I think I will say I was surprised that Brittney was held for under a year. I expected it to be longer. So I think that was the biggest surprise to me, was that it was a lot quicker than I expected it to be.
And I'll guess I was surprised that we offered Viktor Bout for the exchange, because the crimes that they were accused of were just so different. And I don't think that we really wanted to bring Viktor Bout into the equation of this exchange, but we were forced to.
Great. Thank you so much, Ms. St. Julian-Varnon, Dr. Pomeranz, and I personally do want to thank the Kennan Institute for continuing to host such important conversations and expanding the range of what we consider Russian area studies. Thank you to our speakers for joining us for today's discussion. Please visit the Kennan Institute website if you would like to stay up to date with upcoming events and publications, including their podcasts, Kennan X and the Russia File. You can find Kennan Institute's latest analysis of events about Ukraine, Russia, and the region on our Russia File, and the Focus Ukraine blogs, and a Russian language blog, In Other Words. And I particularly do want to recommend their podcasts. They are very varied and very amazingly well produced. So thank you so much to everybody for joining us today, and see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.